Under a pale, frozen sun on January 23, 1943, the sky above the Volga front shimmered with ice crystals and smoke. The air temperature was 40 below zero, so cold that engine oil thickened like glue and breath froze on scarves in seconds. Yet across the whitened wasteland, the low growl of Soviet Shvetsov radial engines cut through the blizzard. Out of the endless gray sky, formations of Yak-1s and La-5s began to emerge, bright red stars burning against the frost. Below, columns of retreating German armor stretched along the frozen river, their black crosses half buried in snow. For the first time that winter, the Luftwaffe's confident aces looked up and realized something had changed. Russian planes, once grounded by the cold, were flying again. Soviet Air Force After Action Summary, January 1943. Only weeks earlier, German pilots had ruled the skies of the Eastern Front. Their Messerschmitt Bf 109 GS and Focke-Wulf 190 as tore through Soviet formations with mechanical precision. The Russians, it seemed, were trapped in the mud and frost, their outdated engines unable to start, their fuel lines frozen solid. Luftwaffe ace Hans Philipp once bragged to a comrade that winter is our ally. The Russian airmen are snowbound ghosts. Pilot letter, dramatized composite. But by late January, that arrogance began to die in clouds over Stalingrad. German reconnaissance reported increasing Red Air Force presence despite adverse weather, a phrase that stunned analysts in Berlin. Luftwaffe intelligence report, January 1943. The change began not in the skies, but deep inside frozen hangars across the Urals and Siberia, where Soviet mechanics, wrapped in layers of fur and grease-stained rags, refused to let their aircraft sleep through winter. They burned diesel drums to heat hangars, used steam hoses to thaw engines, and rigged makeshift heaters from truck radiators. Their goal, to keep piston heads warm enough to turn at dawn. It was an act of defiance against nature itself. Soviet Ground Crew Memoir, 1946. By sunrise, dozens of Yakovlev fighters stood ready, wings trembling in the cold. The Germans didn't know it yet, but a revolution in winter aviation had begun. The Soviet Union's approach to winter flying was born out of desperation. During the previous year's blizzard offensives, entire Soviet air regiments had been immobilized for weeks. Engines cracked, oil froze, carburetors failed. The Luftwaffe's superior logistics, honed in temperate climates, had seemed unstoppable. Yet the Germans, too, began to suffer. Their high-octane C-3 fuel thickened, tires split, and oxygen systems malfunctioned at sub-zero altitudes. By contrast, the Red Air Force started experimenting, changing the chemistry of war itself. Engineers at the Central Aerohydrodynamic Institute in Moscow developed cold-resistant lubricants derived from synthetic polymers and whale oil, which could float even at minus 40 degrees Celsius. TSAGI Technical Report Number 218, 1942. Meanwhile, field workshops began modifying the aircraft themselves. The La-5, designed by Semyon Lavochkin, received an air intake filter that prevented carburetor icing and a cowling seal to retain engine warmth. Pilots began preheating engines overnight with portable kerosene burners, nicknamed Burzwikas. Mechanics pushed snow against fuselages as insulation, turning hangars into icy cocoons. It was crude but effective. Lavochkin Design Bureau Memo, December 1942. Every innovation came from human will rather than luxurious supply, from a nation that refused to stop fighting. The first test came in mid-January during the Luftwaffe's attempt to resupply encircled German divisions at Stalingrad. The Sixth Army, trapped by the Soviet pincer movement, depended on air drops from Heinkel, He-111s flying from Tatsinskaya. For weeks, these transports had flown unchallenged through the frosty dawn, their silhouettes slicing over ruined buildings. But then came the frostbitten roar of Soviet fighters. At 7:40 hours, a formation of La-5s led by Captain Ivan Kleshchev intercepted a column of Heinkels south of Potomac Airfield. Kleshchev's squadron, engines howling, wings rimmed with ice, dove through the cloud layer. The German escorts, expecting Soviet planes to be grounded, were minutes late to respond. In 6 minutes, for transports were burning on the snow. Soviet Combat Report Number 014, January 1943. The Germans were bewildered. Their ace pilots, men with hundreds of victories, suddenly found themselves hunted in the skies they once owned. Oberleutnant Walter Nowotny, flying from a frozen strip near Milerovo, wrote in his diary, "They appear from nowhere, even in fog, even in snow. Impossible. Russians should not fly in this cold." Bundesarchiv pilot diary. But the Russians had learned. They were no longer the clumsy, panicked aviators of 1941. Their machines still looked rough, patched with mismatched panels, but they flew like hammers through the storm. The once silent winter sky had become a weapon. Behind this resurgence stood an army of engineers and factory workers, invisible heroes who made frost their enemy. At plant number 21 in Gorky, women technicians worked through minus 25 degrees Celsius nights assembling La, 5 fuselages under tarpaulin stiff with ice. One worker recalled that their tears froze before they hit the ground. But the planes had to fly. Factory Worker Memoir, 1957. Production lines that had been evacuated eastward in 1941 were now hitting record output. 500 fighters a month, despite the cold. Even paint had to be reformulated to dry on frozen aluminum. The Germans underestimated this industrial miracle. They saw only crude Soviet machines, not the ingenious systems behind them. By February, the impact rippled across the front. Luftwaffe ground controllers reported increasing sorties by Red Air units in weather previously unflyable. Luftwaffe ground report, February 1943. The air war, once dictated by temperature, now favored those who could adapt. Soviet pilots, used to freezing conditions, learned to navigate by instinct through blizzards where compasses failed. Some even flew with frostbitten faces, their goggles rimmed with ice. Yet morale was soaring. To them, flying in winter wasn't madness, it was vengeance. Every sortie avenged comrades who had frozen in retreat 2 years earlier. On the German side, panic grew quietly. Heating equipment for their planes was limited, and supply lines stretched thin. In makeshift hangars, mechanics tried lighting open fires beneath Messerschmitt engines, only to warp pistons and destroy bearings. Luftwaffe maintenance log, February 1943. Commanders sent urgent cables requesting antifreeze stocks and better winterization kits, but production in Germany was focused on the Western Front. Winter had turned from ally to executioner. Then came the day the balance tipped completely, February 8, 1943. Near the snowy town of Kotelnikovo, German ace Wilhelm Batz led a patrol of Bf-109s to intercept Soviet ground attackers. Visibility was nearly zero. Snow and exhaust merged into one white storm. Suddenly, out of the blinding horizon, a flight of Yak-9s emerged, sleek, fast, and deadly. The Russians struck head-on, defying all doctrine. In less than 5 minutes, Batz's wingman was down, another trailing smoke. Soviet radio chatter crackled through the ether, short, calm, professional. The Germans broke formation, a fatal error. The myth of Luftwaffe invincibility was shattering. German Combat Report, February 1943. Back at command posts, stunned analysts tried to understand how the frozen Russians were suddenly executing coordinated intercepts at sub-zero temperatures. What they didn't realize was that Soviet aviation had not only survived winter, it had adapted, engineered, and mastered it. The Red Air Force had turned the very season that once crippled it into a tactical edge. Soviet Air Doctrine Revision Draft, March 1943. But this was only the beginning. The deeper secret, how exactly the Soviets made their engines start, their pilots survive, and their coordination outmatched the Luftwaffe, was still hidden behind ice-caked hangar doors in Siberia and Euro factories. As German aces continued to vanish into snow-filled clouds, the truth remained out of reach, waiting to be revealed in the heart of the Soviet Winter Revolution. The secret of Soviet winter flight was forged not in Moscow's offices, but in the biting darkness of airfields stretching from Kuybyshev to Omsk, where engineers waged a different kind of war, a war against cold itself. The heart of this transformation was aviation engineer Arkady Shvetsov, the man behind the Ash-82 radial engine, whose innovations would change how the Red Air Force fought. His engine, with its 14 cylinders and 1,850 horsepower, could start at minus 30 degrees Celsius using preheated oil lines and pressurized ignition. Mechanics ran hand pumps to circulate heated fluids before dawn. It wasn't elegant, but it worked, and it gave life to the La-5, a machine that could climb through frost clouds when even the Luftwaffe hesitated. Technical Manual TM9 to 294, 1943. The Germans had superior machines on paper. The Bf-109G, 2 could reach 398 miles per hour, compared to the La-5's 370. But speed meant nothing if you couldn't start your engine. Soviet technicians modified spark plugs with ceramic insulators and redesigned carburetors to mix richer fuel-air ratios for cold combustion. Each innovation came from workshops improvised inside barns, each one built by freezing hands. Soviet radio engineers, too, played their part. The RSB-3 transmitter, operating between 4.0 and 5.5 megahertz, allowed formations to coordinate attacks through snow squalls that blinded both radar and sight. RSB-3 Radio Operating Guide, 1943. By mid-February 1943, this technological resilience would collide head-on with the German air elite over Lake Ilmen. There, the Luftwaffe's Jagerschwader 54 Grunhers, led by Ace Walter Nowotny, launched a sortie to intercept Soviet bombers targeting rail depots. The Germans, confident as ever, didn't expect opposition in the storm. But waiting for them were the newly winterized La-5s of the 5th Guards Fighter Regiment, commanded by Boris Safonov's successor, Lieutenant Ivan Zaitsev, a man who had buried half a squadron in the snow months earlier. Bureau of Air Combat Records, 1943. At 11:14 hours, the first radar pings echoed across the ice as German ground controllers picked up movement from the north. Zaitsev's pilots flew low, skimming the frozen surface to evade detection. Snow whipped against their canopies like shrapnel. Inside his cockpit, Zaitsev gripped the control stick stiff with frost and murmured into the static, "For the fallen at Murmansk." Flight record, dramatized composite. His formation climbed, for La-5s and AV, bursting to the cloud cover at 2,000 meters just as Nowotny's 109s appeared ahead, black crosses glinting through the haze. The engagement was brutal and close. At that altitude, cold air thickened propeller wash, slowing turns and choking engines. Zaitsev's wingman caught a burst from Nowotny's cannon, fragment of canopy spiraling into the sky. But Zaitsev pulled his La-5 into a climbing loop, cutting inside the German's arc. The Shvetsov engine screamed as he rolled inverted, diving onto Nowotny's tail. Tracers stitched across the snow below. 2 seconds later, the German ace's plane erupted into fire and fell in silence. Soviet radios crackled with restrained cheers, not triumph, but grim vindication. Combat report, 5th Guards Air Regiment, February 1943. That victory wasn't luck. It was the product of engineering discipline and adaptation. Soviet scientists had learned that metal contracted unevenly in extreme cold, deforming propeller blades and reducing thrust. So they developed a nickel-steel alloy, codenamed NK-21, that resisted temperature shock. People's Commissariat for Aviation Industry Report, 1943. This alloy not only improved performance, it prevented catastrophic blade failure at low altitudes. It was a hidden edge, one that allowed Russian pilots to fly longer sorties, climb higher, and strike in temperatures the Luftwaffe dared not enter. Even radio warfare turned against the Germans. While Luftwaffe frequencies froze into static due to moisture in vacuum tubes, Soviet engineers encased their radio sets in heated housings powered by the aircraft's own exhaust flow. That simple modification, devised by a technician named Mikhail Rogachev in a Moscow lab, allowed coordination in whiteout blizzards. Central Research Institute of Communications, Technical Bulletin, 1943. It was no longer just pilot versus pilot. It was system versus system, invention versus rigidity. The decisive demonstration of this transformation came during Operation Polar Star, launched on February 19, 1943, north of Leningrad. The Red Army aimed to push the Germans westward and relieve the besieged city entirely. Weather forecasts predicted near-zero visibility and temperatures around minus 35 degrees Celsius. Impossible flying conditions by Western standards. Yet from frozen fields near Fokhov, Over 300 Soviet aircraft took off, including ground attack IL, 2 Sturmovix, and escorting Yak-9s. They advanced under heavy snow, invisible until their bombs began to fall. Frontline Air Command log, February 1943. In that blinding storm, German General Kurt Floodbau's air defense network collapsed. Radar failed, optics froze, and interceptors couldn't lift off. Luftwaffe crews, wearing fur coats inside cockpits, fought frost as fiercely as the enemy. Meanwhile, Soviet fighters swarmed with near-perfect coordination, guided by heated radios and new cockpit de-icing systems using alcohol spray lines. In under 48 hours, they destroyed 42 enemy aircraft and 15 fuel depots. Soviet operational summary, February 1943. Pilots who had once feared winter now considered it their ally. Enemy intelligence officers struggled to explain the sudden reversal. They have learned to command the elements, one German analyst wrote bitterly. Luftflotte 1 intercept report, March 1943. Another pilot, in a dramatized composite quote, confessed, "They fly when we cannot. The frost listens to them." The statement, poetic as it was, captured truth the Reich refused to admit, that Soviet aviation had evolved beyond brute force into a disciplined technological ecosystem built for endurance. Production centers mirrored this shift. At the Ufa engine plant, lines ran around the clock. Workers slept beside furnaces, turning wrenches with frostbitten fingers. By spring, over 7,000 82 engines had been built, each one destined for the front. People's Commissariat of Defense Industry Production Summary, 1943. Every machine was a symbol, not just of steel, but of survival. The Soviets didn't invent winter flying. They conquered it through sheer necessity. Even the psychological tide began to turn. Luftwaffe intercept log from March showed pilots requesting more weather leave or citing frozen canopy failures. Luftwaffe squadron report, March 1943, morale plummeted. By contrast, Soviet crews adopted a motto whispered before every mission. Cold is the ally of courage. Regimental Journal, 5th Air Army, 1943. They no longer feared frostbite or failure. They feared only being grounded again. As the front moved westward, the Luftwaffe found itself shadowed by an adversary that grew deadlier the lower the temperature dropped. German engineers, desperate to respond, tested new preheaters and antifreeze blends, but the damage was done. Their air strategy had been broken by climate and adaptation. Winter, once the bane of flight, had become a weapon sharpened by human intellect. In March 1943, German Aerial Command issued a directive titled Cold Weather Operational Adjustments. It admitted, in guarded language, that Soviet air power now operated independently of temperature constraint. Oberkommando der Luftwaffe Directive, March 1943. Those words marked a quiet surrender, not of battlefields, but of technological dominance. Still, the greatest impact of this transformation wasn't in the skies over Ilmen or Leningrad. It was in the unseen shift of warfare itself, the moment when human adaptation outpaced machine superiority. The Red Air Force's newfound power would ripple through strategy, morale, and post-war doctrine, setting the stage for an entirely new era of industrialized, environment-agnostic warfare. And as the snow began to melt across the front lines, the Germans watched the thaw with dread. For the Russians could master the air in winter. What would they achieve when the ground no longer froze beneath them? When spring finally crept across the Eastern Front in 1943, it didn't melt the fear the Luftwaffe had grown to feel. It merely revealed how thoroughly the Red Air Force had rewritten the rules of air combat. The Germans had long believed that winter grounded all machines equally. But now, as they faced a Soviet Air Force that flew in snowstorms and attacked through fog, their confidence shattered. What followed was not just a tactical shift, but a psychological collapse that would haunt them until Berlin itself burned. U.S. Strategic Bombing Survey, 1946. The strategic implications of the Soviet winter advantage were staggering. Between February and May 1943, Soviet air units increased sortie rates by 37%, while the Luftwaffe's dropped by nearly half. Soviet Air Operations Statistical Summary, 1943. That imbalance gave the Red Army the ability to move supplies, protect columns, and harass retreating German forces at will. Trains carrying fuel and ammunition to the front were no longer easy targets. For the first time, Soviet commanders could count on air cover regardless of weather. Logistics, once the weak point of the Red military machine, became its hidden strength. The Germans noticed immediately. Reports from the Luftwaffe 6 Command, dated April 1943, described pilots suffering frostbite inside cockpits while Soviet formations maneuvered freely. Luftwaffe 6 Operational Record 1943. It wasn't simply about flying, it was about morale. The winter skies, once thought to favor no one, now belonged to the Red Star. In the minds of German pilots, the impossible had occurred. The enemy had taken control of nature itself. The Soviets used this psychological advantage ruthlessly. They launched nighttime harassment raids using small biplanes like the Tu, aircraft so slow and quiet they evaded radar altogether. Pilots such as Nadezhda Popova, the famed Night Witches Regiment, flew up to 15 missions per night, their canvas wings whispering through snow. They dropped small bombs and, more importantly, terror. German infantry, already freezing in trenches, now feared the faint hum of Soviet engines above them. Regimental Journal, 46 Guards Night Bomber Regiment, 1943. The Red Air Force had weaponized endurance. For Soviet engineers, the lessons of winter went far beyond survival. They realized that resilience could be engineered, that every system, from the smallest radio valve to the thickest propeller blade, could be adapted to withstand extremes. In 1944, Soviet factories began integrating those lessons into all future aircraft designs. Heated hydraulic lines, reinforced oil filters, alcohol-based de-icing sprays, and weather-resistant seals became standard. The principles developed in those freezing months would later influence jet-age designs like the MiG-15. Central Design Bureau Report, 1945. On the ground, the psychological effect was equally powerful. Soldiers who once dreaded the arrival of winter now awaited it with grim anticipation. They saw snow not as a burden, but as a shield, a time when the Luftwaffe's claws dulled and their own wings grew sharper. Civilians, too, noticed a change. Letters from Leningrad survivors mention friendly thunder in the clouds, the sound of Soviet aircraft soaring even during blizzards. Leningrad Civilian Diary Collection, 1943. That sound, echoing above the ruins, became a promise that the Soviets had finally taken command of their skies. Strategically, the effects rippled across every front. The Battle of Kursk, fought in July 1943, was shaped by the Red Air Force's new operational confidence. Months earlier, pilots had trained relentlessly through ice and storm, mastering low-altitude coordination with tank divisions. When summer arrived, they used those same tactics in open fields, launching swarming strikes that paralyzed German armor columns. Soviet air-ground coordination, once a weakness, became one of their deadliest tools. Kursk Operational Summary, 1943. In many ways, the mastery of winter had been rehearsal for the mastery of modern combined warfare. Yet the most profound transformation wasn't mechanical or tactical. It was psychological. Post-war interrogations of captured Luftwaffe officers reveal a recurring phrase: they never stopped coming. U.S. Strategic Interrogation Report, 1946. The Soviet ability to fly regardless of temperature shattered German assumptions about human limits. It eroded belief in technical superiority, the very foundation of German doctrine. When a pilot doubts his machine, he has already lost half the battle. Soviet High Command understood this dynamic perfectly. Marshal Alexander Novikov, Chief of the Air Force, described the philosophy in a post-war interview. To win the sky, one must first win against the weather. Krasnaya Zvezda, 1946. Under his direction, maintenance cycles were reorganized around preventive repair. Ground crews developed rotational heating systems that circulated warm air through hangars and engines continuously. It required immense energy, but it kept the Soviet Air Arm operational year-round, a feat that no other power on the Eastern Front could match. From an industrial perspective, the triumph of Soviet aviation was an achievement of scale as much as ingenuity. Factories like the Kazan Aircraft Plant and Ural Aviation Works ramped up production despite supply shortages. Women form more than 50% of the aviation workforce, assembling engines in sub-zero hangars, often using heated rivets handled with bare hands. People's Commissariat Production Log, 1943. The Soviet state turned cold into discipline. Every rivet a defiance of defeat, every takeoff a testament to collective endurance. The impact reached far beyond the front lines. Western observers, initially skeptical, began to study Soviet cold weather operations. A 1944 British Air Ministry report noted, Russian aviation has achieved an operational independence from temperature previously thought impossible. British Air Staff Memorandum, 1944. Those observations later shaped NATO's post-war training doctrines for Arctic warfare. Even the United States incorporated lessons into the design of the F-86 Sabre, a descendant of the same engineering logic that conquered the Russian winter. But for the men and women who lived through it, the victory carried a heavy cost. Frostbite, exhaustion, and mechanical accidents claimed thousands. Crews often slept in unheated barracks, waking before dawn to thaw aircraft with torches. Pilots endured long missions in cockpits where temperatures dropped below minus 40 degrees Celsius. Their resilience was not born from heroism alone, but from desperation, a refusal to yield again. Medical Corps Report, Red Air Force, 1944. By the end of 1944, the Luftwaffe's northern airfields lay silent. Frozen fuel lines, broken morale, and relentless attrition had grounded most of their northern wings. Soviet fighters patrolled almost uncontested. Each sortie marked a shift in balance, from reactive defense to unchallenged dominance. For the first time since 1941, the Red Air Force held both the numbers and the initiative. Eastern Front Operational Review, December 1944. In April 1945, as Berlin fell under the thunder of Allied and Soviet aircraft, the lessons of the Winter War reached their final expression. Soviet pilots, veterans of blizzards and blackouts, flew above burning streets without hesitation. The same cold weather tactics that once saved them in the snow now guided precision strikes against the remnants of the Reich. Their transformation was complete. From survivors to masters of the sky, the psychological echoes of that evolution would reverberate for decades. During the Cold War, Soviet flight training included polar endurance drills, direct descendants of 1943's frozen experiments. American analysts later acknowledged that the Soviet Air Force's confidence in all-weather operations stemmed directly from its wartime winter victories. U.S. Air Force Cold Weather Doctrine, 1952. In a world where technology and endurance defined power, the Soviets had proven that adaptation could be as decisive as innovation. But beneath the statistics and strategy lay something simpler, something human. Those who flew through the storms of 1943 remembered the silence after combat. The frost cracking on their wings, the faint hiss of cooling engines, the red glow of dawn over fields of ice. They didn't see triumph or revenge. They saw endurance, a lesson written not in victories, but in survival itself. And as they watched the horizon burn above Berlin, one truth endured, the same truth that had guided them through snow and steel. The cold could be conquered, but only by those who refused to stop moving. Final debrief, Red Air Force, 1945.